Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I have here an illustration that I created, I don't know, probably over a week ago now. And I just sort of let it sit on my desk, and I never really used it up until just a couple days ago, perhaps 3 days ago, when I shot my video pertaining to these two little bins right here. And I just figured before I clear the screen, I would use this one last time just to illustrate what I'm looking to do today. In addition to what's here in this illustration, I also jotted some numbers down here to help remind me what the pertinent information is pertaining to today. So number one is the number 51, right? So 51 is the number of days that have passed since I brought an end to the use of my VermiBag Mini, which is sitting right there in that wooden frame in the background. The European nightcrawlers that were residing in that container, they all got moved out. And that indicates these two bins here, these two flat trays separated by that piece of wood in the middle. The contents of the VermiBag Mini wound up in these two trays. Part of it was the material that got caught in my screen. That includes the worms and any other large chunks of uncomposted material or clumped up castings. And those were the worms. And then the stuff that did go through my screen, I treated that as just the finished castings, but I also treated it as where all the cocoons that were in the material probably ended up as well. So over those 51 days that have elapsed since that happened, I've just been giving this material here, number one, time to dry, as far as the material that the worms were in, and just time for the cocoons to hatch, as far as the material that's in which the cocoons are. So I waited up until 20 days in, 31 days ago, to begin baiting the worms out of the worm box, and then a little later, 23 days ago, I began trying to bait whatever baby worms might have emerged from the cocoons in the cocoon tray. And it was 14 days ago where this box down here comes into play. And that box is the one that we see right down there on the floor with the bubble wrap on it. That's where I put the first haul out of worms out of the worm tray. And they've been in there since then, leading us to the final number, which is 8. And it was 8 days ago that I returned to that new European nightcrawler tray down there on the ground to apply some food. So now, since that bin has been in service for 14 days now, and since it did receive one more feeding, I figured maybe we would check in on that feeding since it was 8 days ago, see how it's holding up. That's one of the objectives for today. But the other objective for today is to go back to these trays here, where over the course of 31 days and 23 days, I've been trying to lure the worms out of the material and do a haul out and bring close to those two systems there. It's basically the overwhelming consensus of the viewers in the comments that that's what I should probably be doing at this point. I asked the viewers in the last video, what should I do? How much longer should I let this process continue? And it did seem like the overwhelming opinion of everyone in the videos was to bring an end to this, get the systems out here, do a final haul out, and bring an end to these so-called temporary trays. I consider them as temporary trays, and that's the reason I never put a formal date on them, because in my mind, they're just a continuation of what was going on in the VermiBag Mini. So, worms are going to come out. They'll be relocated into the same system where all their brothers and sisters were moved to 14 days ago. And we'll probably even add some food as well as a whole bunch of bedding to that system when we get in there. But let's start with these two small trays, get them up on the bench to do a haul out, and then we'll proceed to the release of those worms into their new home. I have here one of my larger plastic containers to help me through the haul out. Since I'm doing the entire haul out of 2 migration zones, it does seem like I'll probably need a fair bit of space to get this done. And then once I'm finished, I'll just go ahead and cover this material up probably with the plastic, just so that they don't continue drying. Because over the course of the past 51 days, 51 days, the material has been given time in both cases to dry. And I don't think it needs to dry any further than it has. So I guess we'll start over here in the baby tray. Let's get these plastic coverings out of the way temporarily. I think they'll just come back into play when I put these systems aside and cover them back up. And at some point I'll just empty these containers, but I won't really do that on video. Doesn't sound terribly interesting. So the haul out of the baby worms will be interesting to see how many worms ultimately made their way over here. I mean, when I did sift the castings out of the material that came out of the VermiBag Mini, I'm assuming that a good number of worms probably slipped through that process as well. So we'll probably see a number of adult worms in here too. But my hope is that we'll see a good number of babies as well. All this bedding material is going to go with the worms into their new home, as well as these castings too. I'm guessing that a good number of these castings might have just made their way over here. I don't remember what I did when I did the refit on this system to get the feeding area established, or the collection area established. I'm assuming that I just probably allowed for a good amount of mixing in of material from the finished compost area. But since we're after baby worms here, I'm going to be hauling a good amount of this casting material out with the assumption that that's where the babies are residing. Because that was the whole idea of this exercise, was to give the cocoons in the material some time to hatch and some time for those worms that came out of those cocoons to make their way over. And I don't know, I definitely see a good number of fairly small sized worms. I'm definitely not good at looking at a worm and judging what its age might be. But it could just be a combination of worms that were either born here or worms that were small enough to just pass through the screen along with the finished compost when I did the screening. So one way or another, it's a collection of the babies here is what we're after. And I guess we also discussed doing one other step, which was to maybe rummage through the contents of the material, or the contents of the bin, to see what's in the material, just in case there are still any baby worms that might still be lingering out within the compost that just, for whatever reason, never made their way over into the collection area. And maybe not take a great deal of time doing so, but pluck out any ones that we encounter along the way. So after we do a thorough inspection of this edge of the bin where the moisture and the food had been, to get all the babies out, we'll proceed with an examination of the rest of the bin. Really quick to see what we can see. If we bump into any babies along the way, we'll be pulling them out too. And I guess if I encounter any bedding in here, I'll go ahead and extract that as well, or any food scraps. I guess the only trick to this is the fact that what I'm looking for are very, very puny little tiny worms. And I guess there's always that chance that we might miss a few. But, you know, it's certainly not the end of the world. This material is going outside into the garden. Any worms that sneak by this process that I'm working on right now will have, you know, a good life outside in the yard, living in nature, continuing to do good work for me, just not down here in my wormery, but rather outside in my garden. And I certainly have no objection to that outcome either. I guess the only reason I like the idea of doing this whole worm nursery thing is the potential of retaining more and more worms for use down here in my worm trays in my wormery. So here and there I'm definitely encountering a worm or two. I'm just sort of trying to comb through the material and then look for movement. They are very puny though, so these definitely have to be worms that were born here, just judging from their size. And I do believe that I'm seeing a cocoon or two here or there once in a while. But I'm at this point not really going out of my way to collect those. Those will just be considered as, you know, further good stuff to put out into my garden along with the baby worms that wind up out there with the castings. Definitely tricky spotting these little guys because they are so tiny in some cases. But it is kind of cool to see the outcome of what was sort of an experiment, not knowing what the results would be. I mean, some people talk about how if the conditions are not ideal, then the cocoons can just sit there and never hatch after a great deal of time. So I did do, you know, a number of things to try to make this environment cozy and optimal for cocoon hatching. But more recently, with the ongoing drying of the material by having it covered only with paper, some people have talked about how, you know, that has become less and less of an optimal condition for the cocoons to hatch. So I guess that's probably one of the contributing reasons why I figured it was time to bring this process to an end. Because if the material just continues to dry, then that does seem like it will just continue to diminish the chances of any more cocoons hatching. But the drying of the material was, you know, done deliberately to try to make that material a little bit less hospitable for any worms that might be in there, and encourage them to go looking for a more cozy spot to be, which was over on this end where the coverings were and where the food was and the moisture was recirculating. And I guess the reason I keep talking is because I do keep bumping into baby worms. It seems like if I were to go back and forth and comb through the material, you know, a number of times and just not encounter anything, then I'd feel satisfied that we've more or less extracted all of them. But it does seem like every time I do another pass, I'm encountering either more chunks of bedding that I can pull out of here, out of the castings, or I encounter a baby worm that I'm looking to extract. Good number of them too. Kind of cool. So I mean, my hope is that we did manage to just collect the majority of them when we did the initial scoop out of the material. And I guess there's still that matter of looking through the rest of this stuff over here too. Geez, do I even want to bother? I suppose if I do, then I'm just going to have to do that in a somewhat faster pace so as not to make this an all-day project. And I just need to keep telling myself that any worms that I don't manage to extract are still doing me good, and it's still an optimal situation, whether it goes this way or that way, and that ultimately just doesn't matter all that much. I guess it's mostly an interest in trying to sort of recoup my numbers to make up for a couple of bad things that have recently occurred in my worm bins, which actually did affect some European nightcrawler populations recently. Stuff that at this point I'm just sort of chalking up to mistakes made on my part. Mistakes that I'm sort of categorizing in the way of basically, number one, letting the material in the bins get too damp, and then that cascading into a situation where material started clumping together, making it really difficult for there to be airflow within the material, and then the absence of airflow leading to the next deadly situation, which is just an anaerobic environment where the anaerobic bacteria sort of takes over, and then the absence of airflow and oxygen within the material leads to the worms dying off. So that's more or less my assumption of what it is that occurred in some of the recent die-offs in my systems. And I guess that has inspired me to try to remedy my situation by basically keeping my systems a lot drier and a lot more densely concentrated with bedding, which just seems like it was always in short supply in most of my systems. So man, this stuff is really very nice, I gotta say. I mean, it was very nice when it came out of the VermiBag already. And, you know, it's had a little bit of time to dry. And, you know, if I find a cocoon that looks like it might still have some potential, maybe I'll pull it out as well. But I guess I'm not going to go too crazy here with this whole thing. The one thing that seems unusual to me, though, is, yeah, okay, here it is. I did lay a towel down beneath the material in both of these trays to prevent the material from passing through the little tiny holes that are on the bottom of each tray. But as I was running my fingers through here, it just felt like all I could feel is the plastic on the bottom. So I don't know if maybe I think that's what happened. Just the towel has basically fallen apart into little tiny bits. Perhaps at some point later this material would benefit from being run through the screen one last time just to capture these pieces of towel fragments, and then those things can be all reused in another worm bin as bedding. So yeah, the towel certainly didn't hold up very well over time. I mean, I knew that it was more or less shot when I originally put it in here, but I didn't think it was just gonna go to pieces like this. Maybe the baby worms actually used it as a carbon food source. That's kind of an optimistic way to think about what it is that actually happened to the towel. Here's a piece that's actually pretty good in size. Good sized piece of towel, but you know, there was an entire sheet of towel laid in here on the bottom. And the fact that I'm only pulling out little tiny pieces goes to show how far along its deterioration actually was, even when it was originally placed in here. All right, I'm satisfied. What do you think? Did we get the majority of the worms out of here? If not, like I said, they're gonna end up doing my garden good once they wind up outside, feeding my plants, and the worms will just be enriching my soil. Look at that beautiful batch of castings. Gotta love it. All right, let's move on. We're gonna give this other system the same treatment, more or less. Basically just hauling out. Let's keep this over here temporarily, and then we'll move it aside, get it out of our way. So we're just gonna do the same thing here, basically, which is to extract the contents of this feeding area. Now, don't forget, 14 days ago when we set up that other new bin that I showed briefly in the beginning with the bubble wrap on it, this was where we had pulled out the worms that made up that launch of that new bin. So we simply reset this baiting area with the assumption that there might still be a few straggler worms hanging out within the material that we would still want to try to extract out of here and relocate into that new system. But chances are we're probably not going to find a great number, because we've probably already pulled out the majority of the worms that made up the population of this tray. So we're going to do the same here. We'll just do a quick skim through, see what we can see. Pull out any worms that we encounter. But here I would imagine any worms we encounter are probably larger in size, if we encounter any more. Every time I came in here, I was trying to see if I can help some of this more chunky material break up into smaller, finer bits of castings, and every time I do, it does seem like it can be broken up into pretty nice fine castings. Here you can see more of the towel. Perhaps here the towel held up a little bit better over time. But I'm not going to worry so much about fishing towel bits out of here. I think that's just something better left for a later point in time. We'll just run this material through a sieve one more time. That'll help us isolate all the large chunks of towel. Maybe when I get around to doing that, I'll also see what I could do about maybe even kind of running these large chunks in between both of my hands. Maybe I'll put another glove on and see if I could break this stuff up a little bit further to help it along from being large clumpy chunks to more fine castings type material. But you know, I'm guessing that if it were to just be used this way in this form out in the garden, it would be just as beneficial. So it's all good. I just didn't expect for there to be so much clumpy stuff, you know. I know that that's kind of what happens when the material is allowed to run a little bit overly damp. But I never really got the sense that in my VermiBag that the dampness had really gotten to that stage where I would consider it to be too damp. I always kind of had this feeling like the material in the VermiBag was possibly too dry or overly dry. And so I was rather surprised to find this much clumped up stuff when I emptied the VermiBag. I didn't really expect to see an entire tray of it collect when I was running the stuff through my sifter. I guess my only other thought was that maybe there's possibly worms tucked in underneath the towel, because in the very beginning it did seem like they were favoring the spaces right beneath the towel. But I guess once we started applying food and attempting to bait the worms out of here, and over time as the material continued to dry, it probably just became less and less of a hospitable place for the worms to remain in. So they probably all pretty much made their way over to the space that we just extracted them from. Man, look at this, just going to pieces. And this is all cotton, so it's all theoretically stuff that the worms should be able to consume, no problem. But like I said, we're gonna deal with separating the towel bits from this at a later time. I just want to kind of get to that point where I can, you know, stick a fork in it, so to speak, right? And consider these two trays as having done their work here, and for the life cycle of the VermiBag to officially come to a close today on day 51, with a little help from these two trays here. All right, what do you think? Did I miss any worms? I probably did. I always manage to spot a few in the video when I'm editing later. But, you know, it certainly doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whatsoever, because it all comes out in the wash, so to speak, right? The worms, any cocoons, whatever, anything that's still left in the castings material, certainly does the garden good once it's used out there. So I'm going to be returning the paper coverings as well as the plastic coverings, but at this point I am going to just cover the tray entirely, because I'm not looking for this material to dry out any further. I'm satisfied that it's got the proper moisture level to be useful, to be used as castings. But even though castings have a terrific capability of hanging on to their moisture, they will dry over time, and I really don't know when I'll get around to emptying these trays, so I just feel like preserving what moisture's in them right now is a good idea, because the moisture level is pretty good. in both of these trays, the material that's in both of these trays. So let's set these aside, get them out of our way, and we're going to bring in the the box that these little guys are going to get released into. And even though they're kind of commingled with a whole bunch of bedding material and castings and whatnot, maybe we'll get a better view of exactly how many worms we ended up with here. Try to come up with a rough estimate of how many we're releasing. All right, let's proceed. So we can see all this debris on the table is the stuff that landed on the tablecloth by passing through the little holes in the bottom of those two trays. That's pretty much what I was trying to avoid by putting the towel in there to kind of, you know, obstruct those holes. But luckily we didn't make too big of a mess. Now, in most of my bins, I guess ultimately in all of my bins, I'm striving to get to the point where I'm not using plastic to cover up. Perhaps in certain unusual cases, perhaps after the application of a very, very large amount of very dry materials or something, and for a very limited amount of time, just so that those dry materials can absorb some of the moisture that would normally evaporate from the bin and gets captured by the plastic, and then the plastic covering would, you know, simply be removed. Here, you know, we're going to be adding a whole bunch of dry bedding as part of what we're doing here today. And kind of like what I did in a bin yesterday, I added a whole bunch of dry bedding. I put the plastic covers on, or was that 2 days ago? But then I came back the following day yesterday, yeah, and I felt that the material had, the very dry material that I had placed right onto the top surface had already absorbed some of the moisture from the other damp materials within the bin. So I took the plastic off and I replaced it with paper, replaced it with cardboard, and I allowed that for only 1 day. So that was just so weird. Like I would press here and then I could see something pop up over there. So I believe we've actually encountered the banana that I fed 8 days ago. And I believe I've got the answer to a question that I had in my mind, which was whether or not the skin of the banana had been breached yet, whether the worms have made their way into the inside of the worm, inside of the banana to feed on its contents, or is the banana still intact? And I mean, just the fact that I'm able to press on one side of it and it sort of reacts like a balloon, that kind of tells me that the banana has not yet had its skin infiltrated. That's pretty interesting. I don't think I've ever put an entire unopened banana in like this. And I'm actually kind of surprised, because that was going to be one of the main deciding factors as to whether I was going to bring food down here or not. Because if the banana was still intact, I figured, well, let that be today's feeding. Combined with a whole bunch of fresh bedding, it seemed like it might not be necessary to add any food today. So, it saves me a trip up to the kitchen. Even though I was kind of hoping to use this as another opportunity to do away with some more kitchen scraps. Because my, I guess I refer to it sometimes as, I refer to it as bandwidth sometimes, as my wormery's bandwidth, or the capability of my worm composting systems to do away with kitchen scraps. You know, due to the loss of a number of systems in my wormery, it does feel like my bandwidth has been reduced drastically. So I've just got stuff piling up in the freezer. I've got coffee grinds piling up. I've got all kinds of stuff that's meant for the worms, but has just not had an opportunity yet to get composted, because my overall count of worms has been diminished significantly lately. So I've got a number of different types of bedding sitting here on standby that we could use for this. I guess we'll start with the use of some dry leaves. I'll lay that down as a little bit of a foundation beneath the feeding area. I've also got some bits of cardboard that I hacked up into little pieces. We'll just go ahead and use up that entire amount. Like I said earlier, I would like to go kind of big on the application of bedding here today. And let's see, I guess we've got another food scrap here that was also added during the last feeding 8 days ago. It's a mango seed, which doesn't seem like it has attracted a great deal of interest. Sometimes the worms really do seem to take a shine to one of these things, but it's kind of hit or miss for whatever reason. I don't know why. So I guess we'll place that here alongside the banana. So we'll put the banana right on here as they're feeding today, but I don't think I want to let the unbreached banana experiment continue. I'd really love for the worms to just be able to make their way in there and start enjoying that. Not to mention the fact that I'd like for the dry materials that I'm adding today to also benefit from the moisture that's coming off this luscious piece of overly ripe fruit. So hopefully we've added something that the worms are going to be tickled pink about. Let's start using some of these existing bedding bits that we extracted earlier to cover up this food with. Because even though I'm going to be laying in even more bedding over the top, something like that banana right there, I could certainly see that potentially attracting pests just because of the fragrant odor of it. I can definitely smell banana when I open it up. I didn't smell anything until I did, but now that it's open, you can certainly smell banana in a big way. So I definitely like the idea of covering up the feeding area down the middle pretty thoroughly to prevent any sort of curious pests from coming over here to check out what's going on in the feeding area of this tray. So let's start stacking stuff up here pretty high up over the food supply. And we'll just use some of this existing material from the edges to do that. This will also afford us the brief opportunity to see how many worms are hanging out in this material throughout the bin. These are all the worms that you would normally expect to find right around that banana, but they're, I guess since they couldn't get into the banana, they were just looking elsewhere for nourishment. And these are nightcrawlers, so it's not too surprising that they're completely satisfied with all these carbon-based bedding type materials to be utilized as nourishment. So, besides a bunch of leaves that I plan to use to top off with here, I've also got some bedding that I want to use, additional bedding, and some of that is going to be bits of newspaper shred, like so. We'll just sprinkle it in here kind of lightly on both edges. All right. And I've also got a whole bunch more cardboard. This stuff I took the time to fragment into somewhat smaller pieces than the pieces that we used beneath the feeding area. Okay. It's all sitting in here kind of loose. I don't really want to mat it down or anything like that. But I like the idea of bringing things in this bin up to this general level that we've mounded up here in the middle. So I'm just thinking I would take some of these larger pieces of bedding bits that we encountered on the way in and kind of use them as sort of a little bit of a foundation, because then I wanted to sprinkle in some leaves over the top of this shredded paper and cardboard and see if I can raise the level throughout this bin to approximately there. So back in comes my box of leaves, and I don't have a whole lot remaining, but I think I've got enough to give this manufactured material on the edges, all this paper and cardboard, a somewhat more natural appearance by covering it with some leaves, but I'm definitely nearing the end here. Not a whole lot remaining. But it's always a good feeling to put in a good plentiful amount of bedding type materials, because you can never really go wrong when it comes to bedding in your worm bins. You can always add more and more and the worms will love it, and certainly can cause no harm. So the only thing remaining at this point, right, is the release of the worms that we collected out of those 2 shallow trays earlier. And once we get that completed, we're done here, and that'll bring an official close to my VermiBag Mini, which when you think of 751 days, that's actually the age of these worms. The age of my European nightcrawler population in general, because it was 751 days ago that I launched off cocoons that all my European nightcrawlers emerged from in the very beginning. And they didn't go straight into the VermiBag Mini, they grew into it. That's what I had depicted actually in the illustration. The illustration actually tried to depict some of their earlier homes here. So prior to the VermiBag Mini, there was a couple smaller containers that they lived in there. I might not have explained that earlier. But I did try to capture that as well. So, enough chit chat. Let's get these little guys reunited with all of the rest of their family. Not to mention the fact that a whole bunch of baby worms are being introduced into the mix, ones that have probably never even met their parents. So I don't think there's going to be any sort of a reuniting of them, because worms just ain't that way. All right, looking good. Got a whole bunch of bedding material in here too, so while I had hoped to have sort of a natural appearance on the top surface with the scattering of all these leaves, we're going to actually end up with a whole bunch of scraps of cardboard and paper, which is exactly the opposite of what I had hoped for here. So we'll have to save the application of yet more leaves to this system to a later day when I've got a replenishment of the supply, since we just tapped out my box. So this ain't your typical worm release like you see usually in my videos. Like I said, in the regular worm tray, we had already done a haul out 14 days ago to originally populate this bin with what I believe to be the majority of the worms that were populated or occupying that space, or basically occupying the VermiBag Mini. And then the ones that came out in the second round were just the stragglers. And then when it comes to the babies too, you know, they're in here, that's for sure. I could see them all over the place, but they're absolutely tiny, some of them. So they're not much for a big show. Not very showy. But they're there, and they'll grow, and they'll be a great addition to my worm composting systems. So this is usually the point in time where I allow the time lapse to show all the worms squirming out of view, but obviously we don't have that today. So I think we're just kind of covering up in a more conventional fashion today. I'm debating on whether I need plastic, you know, because the dry materials I added, all that cardboard, all those leaves, they might benefit a little bit if we were to cover up here with plastic, perhaps for a day, like I did in my other system the other day when I added a whole bunch of fresh bedding. So yeah, why don't we do that? I'm going to cover up for just one more day using this bubble wrap, and then perhaps off camera, maybe tomorrow, I'll just pop in here really quick to upgrade this covering to just cardboard and paper. And then going forward, we're going to be running with no plastic in most of my bins for the rest of the summer. All right, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.